Go.
Welcome and thank you for showing up to my first town hall meeting. Thursday night, October 8th, 2020. And I'll say a few words about where I'm coming from and then open it up to anybody that wants whatever topic you would like to talk about. This whole thing started about 4 years ago when I was talking with Alonzo and he suggested if I didn't like his votes, that I should run against him. And well, I don't like his votes. A lot of his votes are not progressive. They're not moving the state forward. And they're moving forward in spite of his voting no. So I think he votes against the interests of the people in House District 8. So here I am, Paul Kinzelman, running to be your public servant representing you in the roundhouse. So I've listened to you and the polls showing that the number one concern about most people is healthcare. But that also includes behavioral health care. They're both very important because behavioral health care is the root of so many other problems. Second issue is economy. We need good jobs, and the future is in solar, which we have a ton of out here. I fly in the Albuquerque area, and big solar farms are sprouting up like mushrooms all over the place, it turns out. I was looking at, I think it was Loveless, and they're putting up a parking lot with shades to park under. And I was noticing, boy, that'd be a good place to put solar cells. And I looked closely, and that's what they did. They put solar cells. So they're really going up everywhere, and it's a huge job opportunity for the economy. That's where we should be concentrating, and that's where we should be putting a lot of our energy with state initiatives and so on. And there have been some, and Alonzo has voted against them. And the third very important issue is education. Number one, I think teachers are professionals. They should be paid like professionals, and they're not. And under education, I would also include early childhood education is also very important, pre-K and preschool, because that's when children's brains are being formed. That's when the development of their brains is most affected and most important. And if we don't support our children, we basically do not have a future. We just don't have a future without our children. So these are the issues that I'll primarily work hard on in the roundhouse when I get up there for you. Notice also that my opponent, Alonzo, has opposed initiatives for universal health care for all of New Mexicans. He's also opposed helping small businesses that have been devastated by COVID-19. He's also opposed enhancements in making it easier for people to register to vote. He's also been opposed to school funding, which is our future for our kids. We need to think about using some of our land grant permanent fund. I mean, if we use some of it, it's not permanent, but on the other hand, when you're in an emergency, like your house is on fire, you need to use some of your savings account in your retirement fund to get you through that until you can go back to normal times. So there's a lot of this information and more about where my positions are, what's important to me, and what I think is important to people. If you go to my webpage, it's votepaulk.org, votepaulk.org. There's lots of information about where I'm coming from. And so I put a lot more information there than a lot of local politicians have, so that if you vote for me, you know exactly what you're getting, what sort of programs and policies I'll vote for. One of the most important items on that page, I think, is the Compare the Candidates page. There's a button right there on the home page where you can click on that. And it's like if you're buying a TV or a car and you're comparing two things, trying to decide which one you want. You want to compare A and B. There's a whole list of attributes of each car or TV or whatever you want to get. And in this one, there's a list of votes that Alonzo has done over the past several years and what my positions are and how they differ for his. You notice that almost all of his votes have been no. So I'd ask you to go to the webpage and take a look at that and understand where I'm coming from. So I ask for your votes and your support in the election coming up November 3rd. Thank you very much. So I'd like to also turn it over to you folks and find out what is important to you, because I need to represent you when I get to the Roundhouse. So the rest of this, I was just going to open up and let people talk about what's important to them and how that relates to where I'm coming from, my webpage. So take it away. Is there any questions or issues that would like to be addressed?
Well, I have a question and an issue, Paul. So in some research of the state procurement law, it is actually written into the law that the state must take the lowest bidder when they are contracting to get services done. And in my opinion, that does not support living wage jobs, and that does not support union jobs, because we know it costs more to provide employees health benefits, paid sick time, and good living wages. So if you're elected, would you consider changing the state procurement law to support contractors that pay a living wage?
It's a very interesting question. I think there should be more metrics going into decisions on what contractors to use than just purely financial, which is what that is. One of the big problems nowadays is that everything boils down to finances. That's the only language people speak now. They do not speak in terms of quality of service, how people perform their jobs, their reputations, all that stuff. That should all be factored in making a decision. Making decisions purely based on finances is certainly a lot easier because you can compare the numbers. But I think there are some things that are difficult to quantify. And I think what's important is to try to get away from purely the financial aspect of things. And that's been a problem now for the last 30 years, ever since basically Ronald Reagan, that changed greed being a vice to greed being a virtue. And previous to that, companies really cared about, or some of them did, cared about what they did. But nowadays, the only language we speak is money. And I think there are more important things that should go into a decision like that than purely financial. So yes, I would want to be able to have more leeway to the people making decisions about what contractors to use than having purely a financial decision. I hope that answered your question.
So I have a question. So we've learned as we've gotten more involved with our local politics here that just because the legislators meet in either a 30-day or a 60-day session, there's really a lot that goes on all year. There's all these interim committees. There's all this stuff that they're doing right now that they're getting set up for the next legislative session. And I would say that we're pretty much kept in the dark by some of our local representatives about what's really happening, and what are they thinking about, and what kind of feedback are they looking for. Not just a survey once a year answering canned questions, but these are the issues that are being worked on, and this is when we're meeting and where we're meeting, and here's your opportunity to come talk to us. And I'm wondering, what have you thought about what you will do when you're in the Roundhouse to make sure that your constituents in Valencia County know what's going on, and how do you plan to get input from the constituents before you make decisions?
That's something I've actually been thinking about, because I agree there's entirely too much secrecy. Even if people are interested in knowing what's going on, it's difficult to really know what's going on there. And so what I've been thinking of is making a blog of some sort on the web, kind of like a day in the life of. And what we do is kind of summarize the day's event. Anytime that there's some event going on for the day, like you said, committee meetings, things like that, is spend a few minutes summarizing what happened that day in a raw form. And this is what we did, this is who was there, this is kind of what we talked about, these are the issues on a daily basis. And then people could go there and find out, at least from my perspective, kind of like follow me around in the roundhouse to see what goes on. So I think that's one thing. Number two is to be a lot more transparent and publicizing of everything that goes on up there. I'm not sure how to do that formally, but without actually being up there and understanding the constraints and limitations and logistics and all that stuff. But what I would want to do, like I said, is put together a blog similar to what I did when I was involved with Occupy Los Lunas many years ago. In fact, if you go to occupyloslunas.info, there's a blog on there about every Sunday what happened, a little piece of what happened. So that's the sort of thing that I would be envisioning I would do. Number one is to have kind of a running blog of activities and what's going on. Number two is to have probably at this point Zoom meetings like this on a regular basis. Alonzo has like one meeting after the session or zero, and I've actually gone to them, and he only wants to tell people what happened. He doesn't want to accept input. He doesn't want to be held accountable for his votes. And that's something I think is really important, is if somebody votes in some way, they should be able to explain why they did that. And that's something that I would put in the blog, not, I voted yes on such and such. I would say I voted yes on such and such because blah, 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 whatever. So I think that's an important aspect of, if I'm representing you, I would want you to know why I'm doing things. Even if you don't agree, I would at least explain my thought process of why I voted that way.
Okay, but there's also the process I'm asking about of, before you get to the point of making the vote, how are you going to reach out and find out what people are thinking, what they want? And I'm going to say you need to get closer to the mic. It's breaking up.
That would be probably in Zoom meetings or town hall, if we ever go back to that format, to solicit input from people and say, these are the issues coming up in the next legislature. I would like some input on how you feel about using some land grant money from the permanent fund. How do you feel about possibly using a little bit of that money to make up for teachers' salaries? How do you feel about various infrastructure programs, to gauge people's input? So I would be proactive about communicating with whoever you want to, perhaps advertising on Nextdoor, but basically having a Zoom meeting similar to this is how I'd look at it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Jerry has a question. Oh, we can't hear you, Jerry.
It looks like it's unmuted.
Yeah.
Well, you could type it into the chat box.
Well, yeah, you could type your question in the chat box and he can address it that way. Ah, good question.
Well, I think it's important to
Here's a good
listen to
question.
everybody.
So the question is, how will you deal with lobbyists?
Well, I would listen to them and see what they had to say, but if I don't agree with them, I mean, lobbyists are just people asking you to vote certain ways, and they can ask, and I can not vote that way. Of course, that, they obviously wouldn't be generous with their money, but I don't really care. So, I'm not doing it for ego. I'm not doing it for money. I'm doing it to represent people. And I'm going to be voting the way I feel like voting. And I mean, lobbyists can be important. They can bring forth issues and justification for voting in certain ways. And so I think that would be important to listen to them. But, you know, that's, I would still have to make up my own mind. And I think it's important also to not stay in one's bubble. Too many people these days, we have a huge division in this country because everybody stays in their bubble, and scientific studies show that when people stay in their bubble, they become even more extreme. And I think it's important to have conversations across the division between bubbles to understand where other people are coming from. I've been having about a 6-month-long conversation with a friend that's a pilot. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporter, gun enthusiast, and we've been able to keep the conversation more or less respectful for about 6 months. And I find it valuable to understand where he's coming from, not necessarily that I agree with him, but to hear where he's coming from as well as what he says can challenge my views, make me think more about where I'm coming from and possibly modifying my positions. So I think there's great value in hearing people out that you disagree with on the surface. And a lot of lobbyists, that would be true of because a lot of them are big companies, but there are also lobbyists from Environmental Defense Fund, from a lot of very progressive organizations, and their value would be to produce data that would justify their positions and probably my positions also if they're progressive, like care about the environment, the economy, education, healthcare, all that sort of thing. One, for instance, is there's, I guess you can call them a lobby group. It's called the, if you go look at the website, nmhealthsecurity.org,
Mm-hmm.
working for 20 years on how to implement universal health care, basically, in New Mexico because the federal government has failed in their responsibility to do that. And we have a mess of a healthcare system. Their system would cover basically just about everybody. There's some loose ends in the Native American reservations, but basically it would cover everybody in New Mexico for a reasonable price, go to any doctor, and they've been working on it for 20 years. And they just got funding last session, I believe, to do a financial impact study to fully understand what it would cost and what it would mean. And that's the first step to actually implementing it. And the ones that voted against that, he didn't even want to study it. And I think that's our way forward. Unless the feds come through, somehow miraculously do universal health care, this New Mexico put it on the map as being one of the most progressive healthcare states in the country. And we have a huge problem also because of our extensive rural area and poor health care, not only reservations, but in the rural areas because it's just so far from the hospitals. So these are issues we need to discuss and deal with. And that's one lobby group that I would be relying on for information on how best to deal with that problem. So just saying somebody is a lobbyist doesn't necessarily mean, you know, they're representing companies. They can be representing anything. And so I think it's important to listen to all of them. Does that answer your question adequately?
I have a question. I
Yeah.
have a couple actually, but I'll start with one. Start with the easy one. I was watching the county commission meeting last night when something really surprising happened. The very last agenda item was about water. And they saved it to the end because they had a number of people lined up, farmers. The water issue is, as the farmers see it, is that the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District does not adequately provide for them. I think it goes deeper. and that we have an inadequate supply of water because of other factors, both legal and environmental. Paul, if you see water law policy or law changes come across your desk at the legislature or the House, how would you act on those?
Well, it depends on what they are, and I don't have a lot of background in water, so I would be relying on experts, expert opinion on how to deal with that. And I would look closely at the background of the experts. Like, are they from big companies? Are they from conservation groups? Or, you know, what they're, where they're coming from. That would color pretty heavily what sort of credibility they would have in their opinion. You know, all of them should be listened to. Everybody should be at the table having a discussion. But as far as relying on them, I'd be relying on them based upon the organizations that they come from, or their lobby, you know, they would be lobby groups. But I think water is important, and we seem to do a lot of flooding of fields, which to me seems, I don't know if there's an alternative, but it just seems very kind of wasteful. But I just don't know enough about water, the technical details to really have an opinion right now.
So as the commission went down, they had a non-binding resolution, which was, as they said, backed by Alonzo Baldonado, that he would support it should it get to his desk at the state. So there were two separate proposals, one which required the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District to include a farmer, a person who derived their income significantly from farming, or that they break up the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District to separate out Valencia and Socorro counties. What's your opinion of those two non-binding resolutions?
I guess I would have to, I don't like answering quick answers to complex problems, especially ones that I haven't really studied very much. So
Right.
I have to say I'd have to understand a lot more about the situation before I could really have an opinion about it.
Okay.
So I can't really say a whole lot about it now. And there was another comment from someone. Not all groups are lobbyists. Look for nonprofit member and local-led organizations for real people. Yes, well, it depends on what your definition of lobbyist is. I think lobbyists can also be for nonprofit organizations. So I don't necessarily think that lobbyists come from big corporations. I think lobbyist just means somebody that is advocating for a position. And conservation, nonprofit conservation groups can also be lobbyists. So I regard them using the same term. But getting back to your question about water, I have to say I just don't know enough about it. I would have to learn a lot more about it. And I would be relying on the experts in conservation organizations to help guide that sort of thing.
Understood. Another question, if you don't mind, you mentioned a hospital a few minutes ago as one of the lobbyist organizations. What if there's a possibility that we'll be working on a hospital here in the county in the upcoming years? It's already been going for 14 years. I think in 4 years, if I get elected in 4 years, it'll happen. But I'd like to know, would you be open to some changes in state law to allow that to happen for the county, for Valencia County?
Well, I would be open to counties having as much authority to do what they want within their county as possible. I don't see why. Well, it really depends on the issue, whether the state should limit what the county can do or whether it should allow counties to do whatever it is. Without knowing a specific issue, I would say the state should allow counties to govern as much as they can to be as local as possible. As far as a hospital, I can see both sides of that. I mean, we need better health care, but it takes a lot of time to get from anywhere to anywhere in the county. a lot of times. So is one big centralized hospital really the right answer? I mean, I'm not saying what the right answer is. I'm just putting out my thought process on the issue that I haven't thought about that much over the years, but I've been aware that it's been a controversy. But if you put the hospital in one place, everybody has to travel to that one place. And that can take quite a while. I mean, for me, if the hospital were down in Belen and something happened, I would probably still go to Albuquerque because I can be at press in about under 30 minutes. And it takes me sometimes 15 or 20 minutes just to drive across Los Lunas. So in another 5 or 10 minutes, I can be in Albuquerque in a huge hospital. Number two, how big a hospital can the county actually support? I don't know. It probably can't support the size of hospital and the specialties you can get up in Albuquerque. I don't know, but I haven't thought about it too much. Another alternative seems to me that wouldn't be abiding of the hospital mandate would be, suppose we had like 10 urgent care places scattered throughout the county. So if something happens, you go to the closest one of these, which might be 5 or 10 minutes away, they stabilize you and then ship you off to something. Or we could have a helicopter service that could ferry somebody to the hospital up in Albuquerque in fairly short order. I don't know. I think there's a lot of possibilities that should be considered by the hospital people as potential alternatives to building one big, huge hospital that I don't know if we are a rich enough county to be able to support. Because in short order, we can get to very large hospitals up in Albuquerque. One job I had, a couple jobs to go, was I flew a Learjet as an air ambulance. We'd fly people from A to B for medical care. The Learjet had a gurney in the back, and a patient would live back there, and we'd fly them to wherever, and then ambulance would take them to the hospital or whatever with medics.
Mhm.
And we actually flew the jet from here to Socorro on more than one occasion, here to Grants, and here to Santa Fe, which are extremely short trips for a jet. It certainly is not cost effective. But on the other hand, the point of having a jet for that short a distance is the patient would be away from the hospital with large or very competent care for the shortest amount of time. And in fact, I remember we had one flight from Albuquerque to Roswell. It was snowing. There was like 3 or 4 inches of snow. I-40 was basically zero visibility. And some woman was having a problem pregnancy. And the ambulance was driving her from Roswell to Albuquerque. Short distance on I-40 convinced them that they would never get there because the visibility was so bad. So they actually turned around, went back to Roswell, called us, and we flew down to pick her up. And we actually flew her to Albuquerque. And that was actually faster than, even if the roads have been good in an ambulance. So my point is that there's a lot of alternatives to just a big honking hospital someplace that I think are worth putting on the table and having a discussion about and comparing various alternatives. Not only cost, but effectiveness, how long people are, how great a distance are the people away from the hospital that might need medical treatment, especially when they're out in the sticks. So basically, I have no answer right now for that. I'm just posing a number of questions because complex, expensive issues like this deserve a lot of consideration and not making snap decisions about it. Simple answers to complex questions are usually wrong and can make the situation worse. So I don't really have an answer for it. I just have a number of questions that if I were involved in it, I would be going down that path to try to answer those questions.
Would you agree that if a hospital provider like Press or Loveless or UNMH provided a proposal and they felt that it was feasible and viable as a business and sustainable as a business, would you support that if there were accommodations that need to be made in the state law to accommodate that business decision for that hospital provider?
Uh, I would probably, I don't like to commit to anything absolutely without knowing the details, but I would probably be inclined to support it, provided the study also included issues about people in the rural areas being able to get decent treatment in a reasonable amount of time. Or perhaps the hospital itself could have urgent care, small urgent care facilities that would be manned out there for the purpose of feeding patients into the hospital. So I think there's a number of alternatives, but yeah, I don't see why state law should limit a county's decision on that. I don't understand why the state is actually even involved in that personally.
The state defines what is a hospital, and they also require a hospital provider to be, I think it's the term is the opportunity to continue to be that provider needs to be competitively bid every 4 years. I believe that to be correct.
Yeah. Well, some of that stuff makes sense to me without, I'm coming into this with any background.
Right,
But
I understand.
I think it's important for the state to establish standards and, basic requirements, and then the county should be able to go on from there. It's like we rely on the FDA to do tests on drugs, although that's, controversial these days. But, it's nice to have a required base of common understanding of how to do that, and then whatever the county wants to do beyond that, that is faithful to that requirement, so much the better. And some of that may actually be involved with the NM health security people. If we do universal health care, there may be interlocking issues there that need to get looked at. I don't know.
Sure.
But it occurs to me is doing universal health care, getting rid of the health insurance companies, which is essential for decent health care to get the profit motive out of, will cause ripple effects far beyond purely just going to the doctor. So I think it needs to be looked at in terms of what it does for hospitals and everything else. So it's, again, a very complex issue that doesn't have a simple answer.
Okay,
Not a simple answer that's wrong, but not a good answer.
I have kind of a related question, because you're talking about health care issues and you've talked about mental health care. I'm wondering, can you address the issue of decriminalization and or legalization of marijuana as it relates to mental health care and the abuse of other drugs in this state, and what your opinions are and how you will get more informed so you can make good decisions in that area?
Well, there's a lot of groups that are advocating for it. I'm basically, in fact, there's a whole section on my webpage, which I encourage people to go look at for more detail about my background and the reasons for that, votetalk.org. But the short answer is that I absolutely am supportive of decriminalizing, legalizing, and wiping the criminal background for anybody arrested, certainly for using marijuana, and instituting behavioral health care for helping people with addiction problems. We should be treating it as a mental health problem, not as a crime. Let's see. So, and plus, marijuana has also been shown promise to helping people with PTSD, military people and anybody else with PTSD. It's been shown to be beneficial for that. I'd be relying on groups that have done a lot of research in that area for helpful guidance in crafting legislation. But basically, I think it is primarily, the whole drug thing is primarily a behavioral healthcare issue. And we need to build up the behavioral healthcare system that Susanna destroyed years ago. Does that answer your question adequately, or do you have more?
I think that that's good. You know, I think going and looking at your website is probably a good idea, and I hope to see you making some good decisions that help the people in this issue once you get up there.
Well, on the webpage, I tried to give you a philosophy of how I would evaluate various options for voting for or against laws. And without any specifics about specific laws, because I'm not there, it would give you a background of the sort of thing that I use to determine whether to support or oppose a bill, my general philosophy, and what's important to me. And so that way, if you vote for me, you know what you're getting, and you understand where I'm coming from, so you can decide whether it's aligned with your core values or not. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
And I would probably be inclined to keep the webpage up to date, but I think my primary method of communication would be a blog, a very raw, unpolished diary, basically, of what I'm doing related to the legislature, so that people will know what they're getting when they sent me there, and they can evaluate how I'm doing for the next election. Any other questions?
Sure, I've got another question.
Okay, we didn't really talk about education either, but go ahead.
Okay, so this is a question that's related to renewable energy. And I have had people I know who are part of the conservatives just really complaining about the huge, do you know how much plastic is used in making a windmill and how bad that is? And so I'm wondering, can you address that issue and that argument as opposed to using windmills and solar cells, which, yeah, they use rare earth elements to generate renewable energy as opposed to our fossil fuel based energy?
Yes, I've heard that concern as well. And I've always been curious where they say over the life of a Humvee, it will use less energy compared to a Prius because of all the rare earths and the batteries and all that stuff. But I've not seen any numbers that would actually justify that. I'd be very interested to see a study about that. But it is something that we do need to be concerned about, not just doing renewable energy just because it's renewable. We have to do it in a smart way. In fact, the latest Michael Moore movie pointed out a number of problems with our renewable energy efforts, which I've seen some pushback on. Some things in that movie were not really
accurate,
we say. So I don't really know the answer to that, but they're valid questions. In fact, that's the value of having discussions with people that oppose you. It finds holes in your arguments and makes you go back and look into arguments and find out what the truth is. So I think challenging those sorts of things is important. Another problem is solar cells. What's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years when solar cells get decommissioned because they're not efficient anymore? We're going to have a whole lot of waste of those glass cells that we need to deal with, or we need to figure out what to do with rather than just dump them in the dump. So we need to be thinking about that now, about how to recycle them, how to deal with that waste. The same with windmills. I guess after a while, windmills become decommissioned. Not to mention all the cancer that windmills cause. Just kidding. But the problem with most Americans is that, and they try to solve systems by solving that little piece without understanding the whole system. In fact, I'd suggest a book many years ago called The Fifth Discipline. It's written by an MIT professor named Peter Senge, S-E-N-G-E. You can find it, I'm sure, even in the library probably. And his point was to look at large systems from the system's perspective. And his point is, if you find a problem in a large complex system, in one little piece of it, and you go in and fix that little piece to optimize that little piece and solve whatever the problem is of that little piece, without understanding the entire system, you can end up making the whole system worse or breaking the system because you don't understand the whole thing. And that little piece that you fixed had unforeseen consequences elsewhere. We need to start looking at our whole production model. Instead of looking at it from what's good for the next quarter and how to get product out and make money, we need to look at the entire cycle of the products we make. And that includes the pollution that's used in generating and making the product, and the pollution resulting from when the product isn't used anymore. We need to look at packing materials. I mean, most things now are in child pollutant. You can't open those plastic things that they wrap everything in. It's like they childproof. You need the things are packed so heavily that you just can't get them open without breaking it, whatever it is you bought. And that's just crazy. We're not looking at it from a systems perspective of understanding the entire process. And that's what I mean. If you look on my webpage about the philosophy of legislature, one important philosophy that I believe in is the seventh generation philosophy. We need to look at what decisions we make now as how they're going to affect the seventh generation. Is it going to burden them, what we do today? And if it is, we should look very closely about not doing it. One, for instance, is nuclear power. Nuclear power is amazing because it generates energy, and people call it clean energy, but that's only because they ignore the exhaust, which remains lethal for 100,000 years. How are you going to make something, how are you going to protect people from something that's lethal for 100,000 years? That's just crazy. So to say it's clean energy is just plain ignorant, in my opinion. Not to mention all the energy that's used to make it. And I didn't realize this, but at least the old style nuclear energy plants, they only last 30 years because the concrete becomes weak. I didn't know that for many years. They don't exist forever. After 30 years, you got to scrap them. And then you have Fukushima and all that stuff. So I'm definitely opposed to large nuclear power plants of that nature. On the other hand, we do need to look at alternative energy, not to mention cold fusion, which there's a lot big debate about, what that is. In fact, I just saw an article today. The youngest person to actually create fusion in his garage is, I think, 11 years old. So he actually made the Guinness Book of World Records. But we need to start looking also at thorium reactors. Thorium is a little bit lighter than uranium, but there's a lot of advantages to it. You can make them much smaller. They have a lot smaller footprint, so you can diversify them. You can put them in neighborhoods. And they actually, not only do they not produce fuel that's lethal for 100,000 years, they will actually burn up fuel from uranium reactors, from what I've been reading. So that's where we should be putting our research heavily into that. And that might be a very good direction to go. I think we need to be more diversified, as we're doing with solar generation and windmill generation. But the problem with them is nighttime and when it's not windy. We need something to fill in between. And that requires research into storage devices. There are a lot of research that I've been reading about into energy storage. There's liquid metal batteries they've been talking about for years, but nothing has really come to fruition because we're not spending enough money on it. We need a Manhattan Project style investment in this alternative energy and make the entire system work, from energy storage. There's liquid salt research that looks very promising. There's a number of avenues for research that we should be pursuing, and we're not pursuing it with anywhere near enough energy. Another person I would look at is Amory Lovins, Lovins. I think they're based in Boulder, and he's been writing books for years. He's a physicist that could have made lots of money in the commercial area, but he went the other direction and has written books more in the direction of conservation, alternative, and he's got a lot of really good books about what we need and should be doing and we're not doing because of basically the fossil fuel lobbies, which brings up campaign finance issues, which are near and dear to my heart, mostly in the national area. We need public campaign financing. We basically need to revamp our campaign financing laws, make it easier for average normal people to run instead of professional politicians that are rich to be able to enable them to be able to run. Arizona and Maine are two states that are doing a lot with it. In fact, I think one of the previous governors of Arizona was actually a housewife not too many years before she was governor of Arizona. So campaign finance really works. Bring back the fairness doctrine that Reagan got rid of back in the 1980s that requires TV stations to give equal time to both sides of issues. They have to show community benefit. All that stuff was what Reagan worked out and made campaigns be a cash cow for the TVs, and that should not be. Money, there's a high correlation between money spent and the success of a campaign, and that should not be. In fact, I have a whole section on my webpage, votepaulk.org, which talks about that. I want to encourage you to look at that and the various organizations, one of which is called represent.us. It's an organization that brings left-wing and right-wing people together. I actually went to their convention a couple of years ago in New Orleans. There was 1/3 right-wing and 2/3 left-wing people all coming together, including Trump supporters, to work on the problem of legalized bribery of campaign finance. I mean, that's why we can't get anything done in Washington, because people in Washington pay attention to who pays them. And who pays them are big companies and rich. And that should not be. We have to get money out of the system. If we don't do that, we got nothing. And it's less of a problem at the state level, but it still is a problem. We should be doing public campaign financing here in New Mexico as well. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Oh, Dave's got a question.
It's always Dave, huh?
Sorry, we were on the topic of energy a moment ago. Recent news, to me at least, was that PNM they've been mandated by the state to be sustainable, 100% sustainable energy by 2040. I think that's a great goal. It's a pretty long timeline still, 20 years. But they have recently come out and said, we'd like to continue the Four Corners power plant because we can retrofit it to be so clean that it'll be okay environmentally. If PNM come across with legislature to stretch that out, with law to you at the legislator to stretch that out to 2050, say how would you approach that? How would you vote on that?
Well, without looking at the actual data that they might present to justify that, I would be inclined to oppose it. Because we need to start moving. Similar to JFK in 1962 said we should, or was it 1962, said we should land a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth. Nobody had any idea how to do that. But he established the goal and we made that happen in less than 10 years, which to me is just mind-boggling. So when we decide we're going to do something like that, we can do it, provided we put the resources behind to do it, like what happened with NASA. So I think if we decide to go energy neutral in 20 years, I think that's an admirable goal, and we should figure out how to do that. Because not only is it a good goal to have, but even if climate change turns out not to be real, which I don't believe at this point, if it's not real and we do that, so what have we lost? We've lost pollution. We've solved the pollution problem, even if we didn't need to, so what? So I think it's an admirable goal, and it's going to develop new technologies that we don't even know what they are now. I don't believe in the term clean coal also. I think that's a marketing term. And
That's what they're proposing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And I would be inclined to oppose it. But again, it's important to listen to the justification they put behind it, and then also listen to the groups that oppose it. And, you know, because I'm not an expert in that stuff. I fly airplanes. You know, what do I know about that stuff in detail?
While you were flying, Paul, have you ever flown over a power plant and seen their tailings ponds?
Yeah, I deliver freight to Farmington, so I'm familiar with that power plant and the coal mines between here and Farmington. So yes, they're very big, but from altitude, you really can't see anything in detail other than that they're there. But there's a question, are you for appointing or electing PRC commissioners? I could actually see a hybrid approach, because I think there's value in having them elected so they're responsible to people. On the other hand, we're also all not experts on technical issues that the PRC is ruling on. But I've seen a bit of the controversy on what's on the ballot, which actually got my ballot. I didn't see this on my ballot. I'll have to look again.
It's there.
How many county commissioners? And the proposal is to reduce it to 3. And I think reducing it to 3 is pretty dangerous. And there's some advantages in having the governor appoint people that really know what they're doing, as opposed to good old boys that get voted in. But on the other hand, that makes them very political. So at the moment, I'm inclined to not support that proposal, mostly because there's only 3 of them. I think at least some of them should be elected, if not all of them. But on the other hand, I think it's also useful to have people that really know the technical details to have a lot of influence in who they pick. And also to have industry have very little influence in who they pick. I think that's equally important, that they really evaluate technical aspects and aspects for people, as opposed to be sensitive to the bottom line of companies. I don't think that should play a very strong effect in who becomes county commissioner. What is your opinion about produced water? Are you talking about the water that comes out of oil wells and fracking?
Mm-hmm.
I guess I don't know a whole lot about it. It depends on the quality of the water. Are the people that produce the water filtering it and purifying it enough to be used? I mean, after all, on the space station, they purify urine and use that for water. So it can be done. But just taking water that comes out of fracking and dumping it into the river, I think, is a bad idea. But if they can purify it and make it non-toxic, then I could see reusing it, which means you have all these concentrated toxins you have to deal with. But that's part of, you know, what the oil companies need to deal with, is to return whatever they use into a state that's no longer toxic. It is toxic and being used on crops. Well, it's toxic. It obviously shouldn't be used on crops. But it should be the responsibility of the oil companies to make it non-toxic. So
Right.
used.
Okay, so we are at about an hour. Do we want to try and wrap this up?
I'd be fine with that, unless anybody has any other questions. Oh, Chris is up and out of bed.
Okay, so why don't you do
He just hit the wrong button and turned his video on.
so why don't you do a closing statement, Paul, and then we'll turn off the recording.
Okay. Well, I appreciate this time that you spent with me listening to my comments and the questions. And I hope that gives you some sense of my core values and where I'm coming from and what I would use for making decisions up in the roundhouse. So that and the extensive opinions that I put on my website should be able to show you where I'm coming from to find out if you're aligned with my core values or not, whether I would adequately or competently represent you in the roundhouse. So thank you for spending the time with me, and I ask for your vote. And feel free to communicate with me via my website if you have questions for me. I'd be happy to address them. Thank you very much.
And if somebody wants to send you an email, where should they send it?
They could send it to votepaulk@gmail.com, what I've been using for people sending email, and that's also on the webpage.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And good luck in the election.
Thank you.